Welcome back to another Spotlight on Scholarship. Today we'll be speaking with our very own Peter Rerick, Assistant Professor and Experimental Professor of Psychology for our School of Arts and Sciences. Today's interview will be done in a new format, a podcast format by our very own Rachel Suggs, instructional technologist. Enjoy this presentation.
My name is Rachel Suggs, and I'm so excited to be with Peter Rerick, Assistant Professor in Psychology, and you have to tell me it also says experimental faculty. What is that?
That basically means non-clinical for us, from what I have gleaned. Everybody who is a clinical psychologist is listed as clinical faculty. I think that has to do with the PsyD program. And everybody who's non-clinical, they just put us all in experimental. So that's how they divide us up.
Well, it was an interesting title, I thought.
Yes, it is interesting. It sounds like I'm a project or something like that. But we're trying this out.
I need to let everybody know that Dr. Rerick has many specialties. And with your permission, I'm going to list them because it's amazing. Sexual attraction, jury decision-making, sexual consent, and use of police force. Oh my gosh, you could talk to us about so many things for a long time. But I think what I'd like you to kind of start out with is about your specific area of research and how it fits within the psychology field as a whole.
Sure. So my specific area of research is sexual communication. If I had to narrow it down to one area that's my favorite, it's that one. And it actually amounts to sexual miscommunication, because generally what I've studied are the ways and reasons that men and women miscommunicate sexually. And it happens quite a bit in a variety of different ways. Part of the reason with this is when people communicate sexually, they are intentionally doing so non-directly, right? So we rarely, when we're meeting a stranger or an acquaintance, we rarely declare our explicit sexual intent, because then we might get rejected and that's embarrassing. So everybody's trying to do it through these non-verbal body language type signals. And so indirect communication leads to bad communication most of the time. So that's how I would categorize my research, as sexual miscommunication, mainly. So we've studied the effects that sexual arousal has on the things people, or on the ways people believe different things about sexual communication and sex. Sexually aroused men interpret women's sexual intent at much higher rates than non-sexually aroused men. This is just consistent with their goal of having sex, right? So this is how all my research is directed. It's kind of a motivated perception or a motivated cognition type of framework. And so what we're working on right now, most currently, two different main things, I would say. We studied in men and women. We wanted to know, does the target of a woman's behavior influence the sexual intent that men ascribe to that behavior? And does her attractiveness influence the sexual intent that men ascribe to her behavior? And what we found there is that when men were the target of hypothetical women's behaviors that they read about, they interpreted more sexual intent for the attractive woman compared to the non-attractive woman. But when we gave them the same behaviors and they interpreted it with another man who is not themselves as the target, then the woman's attractiveness didn't matter. So they have this self-serving bias of, oh, when attractive women make these advances towards me, it's more indicative of sexual intent than unattractive women, but this only happens for me, not for other men. In women, we did something similar where we asked women, what does it mean when you do this behavior, this behavior? We gave them 25 behaviors. And then we also asked them, what does it mean when other women do this behavior and that behavior, the same 25 behaviors? And we also manipulated the target's attractiveness of their behavior. So what does it mean when you do this to this attractive man compared to this unattractive man? And what we found there was that women, when they were describing other women's behavior, said that target's attractiveness matters. Other women's behavior is more indicative of sexual intent for attractive men than for unattractive men. But they did not apply that same rules to their own behavior. So this is pretty consistent with what we've seen in the past too, whereas when you just on a base level ask men, what does it mean when women do this? they rate it more sexually than when you ask women, what does it mean when you do this? But when you ask women, what does it mean when other women do this, they actually respond just like men. So there's a question of whether this is an actor-observer discrepancy or whether there is sexual motivation on the part of men. So that's all to say my area of research is in sexual miscommunication.
Great. Golly, that sounds complicated.
It is, but it's very interesting.
And what triggered this primary interest for you? How did you get started with this focus?
So the way that I got started on this was kind of by luck. I went to graduate school and I had selected an advisor who was studying things I thought were interesting. And when I visited for my interview, she said, here's the project I'm thinking about working on when you get here, if you decide to come, which I ultimately did, of course. And she described this study where she says, I think sexual arousal primes men to interpret women's behavior as more sexual compared to when they're not sexually aroused. And so one of the issues with research in this area is you ask people, they're sitting in a lab or they're just talking here like you and I, what do you think it means when women do this? But the real context where you're genuinely trying to interpret this behavior, you probably are sexually aroused, right? If you think about the actual context this is happening. So she set up this study where we had some men who were sexually aroused through a priming writing paradigm. We just had them write a short sexual fantasy, and these other men were not sexually aroused. We just had them write a short story about going to a coffee shop, very non-arousing, and we just compared their ratings on 25 hypothetical women's behaviors, and we found that the men who were in the arousal group rated these behaviors as more sexual than the non-arousal group. And we actually found in 3 separate studies on this topic that it was mainly single men doing this, and men in a relationship were not exhibiting this strong of a pattern either. So she was actually the one who got me started and interested on this topic, because when we did this study and I saw these results, I thought, wow, this is just one of the most interesting things I've ever heard. And since then, that's really been my main interest and focus.
That's fascinating. I don't think there are a lot of people out there that understand that there are actually researchers paying attention to these sorts of things. Do you work as a team or do you work as an individual on this type of research?
We definitely work as a team. So I was fortunate enough to come into my graduate cohort with another advisee of my advisor, who I remain the closest of friends with today, actually. So I actually have done all of this work in conjunction with him. We've obviously worked with our advisor too, but since we've graduated, we've branched out on our own a little bit. So it's all been a team effort, which makes it that much more interesting, because all the time we talk about why is this happening or what would happen in this situation. And lots of times he has great ideas that I don't think of, and hopefully I provide the same insight for him at times too.
After you do your research, as you're doing your research, how does it get presented?
It comes in multiple forms. So the first thing we do usually, just because it's the quickest and easiest, it happens every year, is we'll present the data at a conference. So we might present it at a regional conference like SWAPA, the Southwestern Psychological Association annual meeting. And we also will usually present something in this area at APLS, which is the American Psychology Law Society annual meeting. And that one is a national conference. So I think there are probably more people who really care about it at that conference. And we always get a lot of questions when we present this research too, which I think is good because people are interested. But we also publish it. We've got, let me just think to myself here, we've got 3 papers on this topic that are published in peer-reviewed journals, and then we've got another one that is currently under review at a different journal. So that's the ways it gets out there.
I understand that you've got some Oklahoma City University students that are working with you on this, and with the possibility of maybe helping out with this presentation in the spring. Talk to us for a minute about that.
I have a research lab here at OCU, and it largely involves data collection, which these students were doing. And the deal is, to me, these are students who want to go to graduate school. They have an interest in pursuing an advanced degree in psychology, maybe not exactly what I'm doing, but something similar. And they help me collect my data. They'll help with the administrative day-to-day tasks, running participants, collecting the data, maybe a little bit of analysis here and there. And in return, when we get that data, they get to present it at conferences. And getting involved with research like that and presenting data at conferences is probably the best thing, I mean, besides having a good GPA, is probably the best thing students can do if they want to get into graduate school. And the great thing about these conferences for me, and I try to encourage these students who go, is when you go to a conference like this and you present a poster, you just have to talk for like 2 minutes about it to people walking by. It's very low pressure, first of all. Second, you're in a room with 100 other posters of a huge variety of topics. And so I think when students go to conferences like that and they're exposed to 100 different studies at a time every 2 hours, they're bound to find something that they really like too. Hopefully like I did. I sort of stumbled upon it, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, wow, this is awesome. I hope that they have that same experience when they go to a conference like that too.
Has this research either supported or contradicted some of your assumptions as you have turned into an expert in the field?
This research has opened my eyes. I have to say, I started doing this when I was relatively young. I was very inexperienced when I got to graduate school. I was 22 and I really didn't have in-depth training about this stuff. So I didn't enter with too many biases, but most of the time I think what happens in our studies is what I would expect. And the framework that we work through is an evolutionary framework, basically, an evolutionary psychology framework. And so just briefly, I could talk about error management theory kind of guides our assumptions. So error management theory says men and women make mistakes in sexual interpretation that are reproductively advantageous. We're talking about millions of years ago. Up until now, we've evolved these biases. It is more reproductively costly for men to miss an opportunity to have sex with the woman, because men can have 1,000 kids, right? Not anymore, because they have to pay for them.
Gee, I hope not.
No,
Yes, right.
but,
Financially, it's difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
So if a woman is interested in having sex with them and they don't perceive it correctly, that is a reproductively missed opportunity for men. For women, they tend to underperceive men's commitment and interest in them because it is more reproductively costly for women to be impregnated by a man who doesn't actually care about them. And this just goes back to why women are more choosy about their sexual partners than men are. It's the difference in cost, right? So this framework has guided most of our assumptions, and frameworks similar to this have guided most of our assumptions through these studies. And for the most part, what we expect to happen happens. So I don't think I came in with too many preconceived notions. I've basically just been learning so much as I've been going, rather than having these preconceived ideas about what would happen before I did.
Okay. Social learning. Social learning is a term that I'm not that familiar with. Can you talk about that for just a few minutes and explain how the world around you interacts with social learning?
Yes, so this issue of social learning came up because of another finding that we had recently. So in this last study I talked about that we did, where we were manipulating the target of the behavior and the attractiveness of the behavior, we included a question that said, how physically attractive do you think you are? And they just rated themselves on a 1 to 7 scale. It was one question. And what we found was people's physical attractiveness that they rated themselves was predictive of their responses to the sexual intent measures. So more attractive men rated women's behavior as more sexually or as having more sexual intent than less attractive men. They did this when the target of behavior was themselves, and they also did it when the target of behavior was other men, but the effect was much bigger for themselves, of course. For women, more attractive women rated their own behavior as more indicative of sexual intent compared to less attractive women, and they did this for their own behavior and for another woman's behavior too. So all 4 of the outcome measures were predicted. So this was actually an example of my colleague that I work with most of the time. This was actually his idea. We were thinking, why would this happen? And he hypothesized it was because of social learning. So we'll just start with the men. These men, the more attractive men, find that as they go through life, women's behavior actually is more indicative of sexual intent when it's directed at them because they're more attractive or higher status or better looking, whatever it might be. So they learn that these behaviors actually do mean different things compared to what less attractive men might learn. For women, when they're rating their own behaviors or the behaviors of another woman, my colleague's hypothesis about this was that they have learned through how men respond to their behavior. So the most attractive women have learned, when I do this, men always think I'm interested in sex. But I might not be, or maybe I actually am. Whereas less attractive women don't get the same response from men. So they have learned from the world's response to what they're doing, what their own behavior means, basically. And that goes into what they believe they're intending to do if they engage in a given hypothetical behavior that we ask them about. So social learning is just exactly that idea, that people learn through watching other people, but also through the feedback and input they receive from other people. And we do this all the time with basic relatable things. We understand what emotions are appropriate to display at certain times. It would be not appropriate for me to, break down and start crying on this podcast because 10 years ago my dog died, right? And we don't have to be told that. We can just observe the world and say, okay, nobody's doing this. This is not how we should act in this situation.
This is just such a fascinating topic for me. How does your research impact life on a campus, or how might your research impact life on a campus like OCU?
I think the main impact that my research has on a campus is the students' opportunity to participate in it, and that leads to bigger and better things for them. So students can participate as research participants in one way. That gives them the experience of what research is like. And I usually will offer my classes a small amount of extra credit if they want to participate in this study. Most people usually do. And if they're interested, they can see how things work, right? The other way is through my undergraduate research assistants. So a few of them were with me last year and they've continued with me this year. They've helped collect data, like I've said. Now they have submitted projects to SWAPA, so they're going to submit their poster presentations like we talked about earlier too. But the important part of that, I think, is now that they've gained this research with experience, or this experience with research, they are now, I have 3 of them actually right now working on their own projects. And so they get this exposure through their classes. They take their research methods, their statistics classes, so they can understand the methodology, basic methodology. And then by participating in my lab, they can see how we apply these broad concepts, experimental design, causation, all that type of thing. And some of the older students now have taken it upon themselves. They say, hey, Dr. Rerick, I want to work on this project. What do you think? And they're outside of my areas of expertise, but I can guide them and say, look here for this answer, look here for this answer. Let's use this scale to measure this thing, whatever it is they might be interested in. And so that is really the holy grail for undergraduate students. They come up with their own projects, they conduct the research, they do the analysis, and then hopefully they get to present it somewhere at a conference. And then when I write them a letter of recommendation for grad school, I can say, hey, this person's already doing graduate student level work, and this is what they've done, this is where it went, look at their CV, there you go. So I think that is the 2 main ways, but the main way is through participating in basic lab activities leading to ultimately conducting your own project.
What is perhaps a common misconception about the kind of work that you do, perhaps that you'd like to dispel?
I think a common misperception of the work that I do is that it doesn't exist. And it's hard for people to know, right? But we're trying to get it out there on platforms like this, right? It goes in peer-reviewed journals, but those can sometimes be difficult and maybe even a little overwhelming for the non-psychologist person who thinks I can't possibly understand this. Fortunately, this stuff is not actually that hard to understand, at least in my estimation, because it's a relatable topic to everybody. So that's the misconception that I would like to dispel, I guess, is that if you have questions about what is normal sexual communication or general sexual behavior, I don't generally study general sexual behavior, but there are very good scientifically sound answers to those questions. And if you're especially a student who has access to all these journals and databases, you can find them and you can understand them.
What are some of the moral implications or quandaries that you've had to navigate through in this specific topic?
I'll give you an example that I think speaks to the broader issue. So the sexual communication stuff is important basically because it has a lot to do with sexual consent issues. So when you go, not you specifically, but when sexual assault cases go to trials, there isn't a disagreement about whether or not the two parties had sex. Generally, there's a disagreement about whether or not one of the parties consented to it, but they both usually agree we did have sex, yes. So it becomes important there. And so the example I was going to get to is when we were presenting the data from that first study that got me started on this, that found that sexually aroused men interpret women's behavior systematically more as having sexual intent than non-aroused men. We had a woman come up to us at the poster presentation, and she said to us, I am a raging feminist and this makes me really upset, but I think it's good research. And the reason for that, at least I think she was getting at, is that type of result might sound like excusatory on men's behalf, right? It might sound like, well, it's not men's fault they keep doing this. This is just the way they're hardwired. And it's not meant to be that. It's meant to be an observation of the reality of the world around us. It's not meant to say, well, you can't blame us for this now, right? But I can certainly see why people would feel that way about it.
Why do you think that it's important for you to take a scientific approach to the study of this topic?
Well, I think the scientific approach is just important for finding the truth, but when you're studying something like this, like I was kind of getting into earlier, that can become politically charged, you have to make sure that you are following the proper steps to communicate information, lest you be perceived as having an agenda of some kind. And so I think as long as you can fall back on saying, I tried to pursue the most objective truth I can, and when we write papers, we say these are the exact methods we use, these are the people we studied, these are the questions we asked them, that's the best you can do about being honest about exactly what you did and why you did it and what you actually think it means. So you have to do your best to try to make it sound good, I guess, or acceptable, but at the same time, telling the truth about exactly what you found and what you did too.
Okay, this is a very heavy question. Are you ready for this one?
Go ahead.
What's next for you? Where are you going next?
As far as research goes?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the very next thing, it goes back to the findings we had with the attractiveness predicting people's interpretations of sexual intent. So in that first study, we weren't expecting as much out of attractiveness as we actually got, but now the question is whether, at least in my mind, will people change their ratings of their own physical attractiveness in response to the attractiveness of the target of the behavior? So in the first study, we just asked people in the very beginning of the study, what's your race, what's your age, how physically attractive do you think you are? So we couldn't infer anything about causality there. It was just correlational stuff. But what I hope to do next is to do a very similar study where for men, we give them a picture of an attractive woman and unattractive woman, ask them what it means when they do all the same behaviors, and then we ask them how physically attractive do you think you are after that. And what I would expect to find is that men will inflate their own ratings of their own physical attractiveness when they were thinking about an attractive woman engaging in these behaviors with them versus an unattractive woman. But this change in physical attractiveness shouldn't happen for when they're rating the behavior when it's directed towards a generic man who's not themselves, right? It's that self-serving bias idea again. So that's where we're going next. I'm actually collecting data on that study right now. So we'll see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen yet, but we're working on it.
How long do these studies have to process before you are ready to present? This is an awkward question because I know there are a lot of variables.
Yeah, so the main issue really is how fast can we get enough participants? So for a simple design like that one, I would want to have around 100 men in the sample, and with just a basic 2-group design. And I can do that depending on the way I do it. I can do it very quickly. If I'm collecting data here at OCU, it takes longer. We don't have as many students, especially in psychology. We don't have nearly as many men. It's about 70% female in psychology. Sometimes it's higher than that at certain universities too. But if I'm collecting data on Amazon's Mechanical Turk or some other survey platform where I can pay people to take it, I can actually collect all the data I want in 2 hours. So it just depends on who I'm trying to get the data from. That's the main part that takes the longest. And of course, the design of the study takes a while too, but if you really work at it, you can be done with that in a couple days if you focus hard on that.
All right, I have one last question for you, and we do have a couple of minutes for this.
Okay.
When you were a little boy and you were thinking about becoming a man, what did you want to do with your life?
Well, I mean, depending on how little you want to talk about, I had all kinds of ideas when I was little, but I think from the age of 14 on, actually, I wanted to be a researcher in psychology, and that's all I knew because I had no idea what that actually meant. I didn't even know for sure if that meant be an academic or what that actually meant or anything like that. But I knew I was always interested in these topics, and I wasn't, of course, interested in this topic that we've covered this whole time because I didn't even know it existed. I didn't know anything, basically. But I always was interested in psychology, and so as I got older and older, my interest narrowed more and more until I really found what I really wanted to pursue for most of my career. I believe I will be pursuing this. But yeah, since 14, actually. And I know that's not normal, so if anybody, I know a lot of people are in college and they're like, I don't know what I want to do when I'm 20. That is normal. What I was doing was not normal. So, but it's the truth, 14.
Amazing. I really can't thank you enough for spending time with us to talk about this. You have so many other topics. I must tell you, I could sit here and talk for about another hour and a half to get more information from you, but I appreciate you spending time with us. Is there any way that students here at the university can get in touch with you if they want to help you with your research?
Yes, if you're interested, my email is on the university website, and so is my office number. You can pop by sometime if you want to do that, if you want to chat or you want to get involved or you want to ask a question about maybe something I said here today. I would love that. I love to talk about this stuff. So definitely just check the website.
Great. Thank you. We've been talking with Dr. Peter Rerick, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Experimental Faculty.
Don't forget that.
Yeah, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the interview. Tune in next month for our next edition of Spotlight on Scholarship.